I am currently working on a large cabinet project for the workshop, which involves cabinets made out of melamine. Melamine, of course, means edge banding. So in this video, I wanted to talk about edge banding, both the techniques that I'm using and the tools that I'm using. While none of this is particularly new information, it is all out there on the internet. It'll be new to some people. And if cabinets are in your future, you'll know a little bit about what the options are and how approachable or not it is. So first up, what is edge banding? Well, it's a banding that you apply to the edge of material. In this case, I've got some melamine, it's particle board substrate, and it's a bit ugly to look at. Plus it can chip away. It's not the most durable material where it's exposed. If I flip this around on this side, you can see I've got some edge banding, hasn't been trimmed yet, that it's the same color as the board, so it looks a lot nicer, and being quite thick and plastic, it provides a lot more protection than just the crumbly particle boards. So it's a good way to finish the material, creates a much nicer look, and it makes it more durable. Isn't edge banding that weird stuff on cabinets that peels off all the time and really shows how cheap something is? It can be, yes. If edge banding is applied incorrectly, it is poor quality edge banding and it isn't finished off properly, yeah, it will not stay on and you'll have a terrible time. High quality edge banding applied correctly with the proper finishing process, making sure there's no ridges left behind, will stay on pretty well and stay on for quite a few years. It's not an invincible product, but it will last quite a long time. First, let's tackle quality edge banding. This is the type of stuff that you'd find in a big box store. Melamine tape, often just labeled as iron-on edge banding. It's generally around 0.3 millimeters, might measure a little bit more, but that will include the glue on the back. And it looks fine from a distance, but it just rips. You can't bend it too much before it just snaps. And there's not that much glue on it. It's just not great quality stuff. Because it is so thin, you can't really get a nice round over on it. Because it's so thin, there's not much glue on it, and trying to apply heat to it will often cause deformation of the tape itself, discoloration. It's just not a great product for long-term cabinets. It'll do the job, but if you can spend a little bit more, you can get a much better product. So what is a better quality product? Typically, you're going to be looking at ABS or PVC edge banding. They're not quite as hard, they're softer, so they'll absorb some damage, and they come in a variety of thicknesses from about 0.5 millimeter at the thinnest up to 2 millimeters, which is very, very chunky. This here is a 100-meter roll of, well, what's left of a 100-meter roll of ABS edge banding, 1 millimeter thick. And by comparison, let's get a small piece. By comparison, this can bend so much more, and even when I bend it on itself, it doesn't snap, it will bend to a right angle, and there is considerably more glue on it. Combination of all these factors means that I can have a nice soft round over on this. It'll be much more durable for years to come. Downside is it's a lot harder to apply. Because I have quite a few cabinets to do now and also in the future, and I'm using much heavier duty edge banding, I've opted to go with an edge bander that I purchased from Carbotech rather than using an iron to iron on the edge banding. There are quite a few types of designs of edge banders. This is a stationary one. It'll do straight edges, it won't do curves, but for my purpose, it's pretty good. To get an idea of how this works, we'll do a quick tour of all of the parts. The main thing here is the heat gun built into it. It's a Steinel 2000 watt heat gun with 1000 and 2000 watt settings. Dialable heat control for whatever product you're using, which blows hot air into where the edge banding feeds, so it's melting the glue directly rather than heat coming through the edge banding then into the glue like if you were ironing it on. There's a little guillotine here, which we'll talk about in a moment, which cuts the edge banding to length. Two guides that make sure the edge banding's positioned correctly on your board. A roller that sandwiches the two pieces together, so you can apply pressure to the edge banding and to the board so you get a good bond. And there's this little groove here between the table and the edge banding. That's so that the edge banding can overhang on both sides of the board. You want this so that you can trim it properly, because if you've got it lined up perfectly with one edge, well, it may not be perfect, and then you've got to take the whole thing off. Here's the first tip for using this machine. This mark here didn't come with it. It's Sharpie. It's a good indicator for where you should actually cut the edge banding off so that you're not wasting quite as much material when you're edge banding. Here's tip number 2. At the rear of the machine is a spot where you're supposed to load the edge banding on and then feed it through the guides and it'll turn around and all that. It's pretty much useless because it doesn't work. You need to have like something that plugs in the rolls to actually make it turn, otherwise it just kind of jams and then you have a bad time. Instead, what I've done is made this plywood spool that the edge banding can just ride on. Acts as a really poor quality bearing. I'm using a mag switch to keep it in position. Mag switch isn't actually screwed into anything, it just holds the whole thing in position. And then this can rotate freely, and it actually makes quite a big difference in terms of the ease of applying the edge banding. So make these, whether you use the built-in holder on the edge bander or make something like this, you need the spool holder to have a good time with the edge bander. Tip number whatever we're up to. Melamine tape cuts super easy using this guillotine. You just push down, cuts right through it, no problem. However, when you're using the 1mm thick stuff, or even probably the 0.5mm stuff when you're using ABS or PVC, because it is tougher material, that really hurts your hand when you push down like that with enough force to cut through it. So I've got a really good solution. So I'll demo what the actual process looks like. This is a draw piece, one of the sides, so I just need it on one edge. First, I'll feed in the material to about where it's going to blow, switch on the machine. We're applying pressure towards the roller. When my board gets to my mark, I'll cut it. And we're done. And in the interest of balance, here's the process using that melamine tape and a regular household iron to iron it on. First, rip a piece to length, then leave 25 to 50mm overhang on both ends for trimming. With the iron on the cotton setting, so pretty hot, and no steam, press firmly and constantly move the iron back and forth. If you leave it in any one spot too long, it'll discolour the banding. While it's still hot, go over the whole thing with a roller to apply extra pressure to help it bond. Before we trim the sides, we need to trim the edges, because otherwise you can lift the whole thing off by accidentally knocking that. Now, if I was using the melamine tape, I would highly recommend these pair of flush cut cutters from FastCap. They do a fantastic job. For this thicker material, I wouldn't recommend them. They will work, but they're not necessarily the best choice. However, this is not rated for 1mm thick material, so I'm not going to be too hard on it. If you are using melamine tape, or thinner stuff, this is fantastic. You basically butt it up and cut it. But you can see with the thicker stuff, it requires a fair bit of force. That's actually done a very good job of it. And it's what I've got on hand, so it's what I'm using. Alternative is using a chisel, getting that up against there. It does a pretty good job too, maybe a little bit less controlled unless you're careful. But it gets it fairly flush, and you could always file that if you need it to be a little bit smoother. The next step is to take care of the edges of the tape, removing that so that they can't be caught. And it also looks a lot better if you don't have tape hanging everywhere. Now, in a very repeated theme of if I was using the thin melamine tape, I would use a tool. This is the same situation here. These type of trimmers that go around the board and you manually push work great for thin material, thin edge banding. So you place it over, there's a little groove for the edge banding to sit in. Single pass will generally clean it right up. This one I find is actually a little bit better. It has a slight chamfer if you advance the second cutter. This one from FastCap does a reasonably good job, but I've never found fantastic results from it. I always need to come back and just ease the edges because it's just not quite flush enough for my liking. However, neither of these are rated for 1mm, and don't do it on the 1mm stuff because it's bad. You just tear out everywhere and you'll have chunks of plastic and sadness. Much better option is the router table. So what makes the router table the best choice? Well, unlike the manual edge trimming devices, this leaves a perfectly clean result. Single pass gives me a round over or a chamfer if I opted for a chamfer bit. It's really fast, like very, very fast. Single pass per side. It saves so much time, but there is just a little bit of setup that you need to know. You can see that I have an auxiliary fence clamped to my router table fence. This is just a piece of plywood that has some grooves cut in it, dovetail grooves for some clamps. It's actually part of another jig, but that's unimportant. This does two things. First thing is that this provides a larger reference surface for when I'm trimming the banding on larger pieces. So this is a safety feature, having that larger surface works really well for that. Second feature is, because this is raised up from the table, there's actually space for the edge banding to go. So it's still flush up against the fence, but when it gets to the router bit, it hasn't been skewed by pushing up against a fence or angling or anything like that. And the second thing to note is the bit itself. This is a radius laminate trim bit from Freud, 41502. It looks just like a 1/16 inch radius round over bit. However, there's a bit of a straight section to it, so it's going to be able to do the flush trimming plus the radiusing all at once. It works really, really well. The final thing that makes using the router table the greatest choice for this is the dust collection. But Paul, look at all the dust that's everywhere. This is the result of trimming 25 boards so far. That's what hasn't been caught in the dust collection. There's no cleanup, very minimal cleanup I should say, while getting a perfect result. It's very hard to argue with the router table. Again, in the interest of fairness, this is the process for using a handheld trimmer on the melamine tape. First is the fast cut quad trimmer, pressed together over the board, and the majority of the material is peeled away. I find this leaves a hair of material proud on all sides, so it's not quite finished. Switching to the No Name brand trimmer, I'm able to get an actual 90-degree cut, but only after a few passes. The trimmers leave a hard 90-degree edge, so a sanding V-block like this can be used to break the edges and make it less sharp. Tip number 4. The order in which you put edge banding on matters quite a bit to the end result, something that I didn't do. Ideally, you'd apply the less seen edges, so in the case of this upper, this would be the top and the bottom. Then the face of it would go last. Otherwise, if you do the more visible face first, the seam will be more visible, or visible from the front rather than from just underneath. It's not the prettiest thing that you can go for. There's a reason why these are test cabinets for in the workshop rather than in the house. So I learn all these things. There you go, that is pretty much all of what I know about edge banding, and for a home gamer, that's pretty much all you need to know to get pretty great looking results. Edge banding is a bit of a hassle, but when the alternative is having to apply paint to every single surface in a cabinet on much more expensive material, because melamine is dirt cheap, it's not the worst. While it's a drawn out process, it doesn't take particularly long. You don't have to wait for drying times, so you can just really get at it without having to stop and wait for several coats of finish on cabinets, which would make an already tedious task even more tedious. Give proper edge banding a go. It's not that hard. It's a bit expensive, but the results are great, and I'm happy that I did it. Thanks for watching.